Hello, welcome to my channel. I'm Tina. This video I thought a lot. Should I, after I show you the several authentication cases, then show you the flow actually being done by Spring Security, or should I show you the flow first, then show you the different ways to configure the authentication? Anyway, so I decided to come with the flow first. So probably if we still have other questions, we can come back. Okay. Now, let me show you how Spring Security actually do the authentication for us, no matter it's success or not success. Okay. So next slides. First, we start from here. This input is when a user in the browser type their username and password and click login. Okay, click this login button, and it's gonna be the request. It's gonna go to our first filter. The filter is called the username password authentication filter. First, as I mentioned in which video, talking about delegating filter proxy, that video. This filter, it will implement filter interface, okay, but it's not object initialized by Tomcat. Instead, it's actually a Spring Manager bin, and which implements a filter interface, and it also implements others. Later on, you will see. And inside this filter, it definitely has a do filter method, and it also has a method trying to do the authentication, which is a method called attempt authentication. We will have the request response, because all our login information, username, password, is in the request, right? So this authentication, attempt authentication, it will come out with an authentication object. This is an authentication object. This authentication object will encapsulate the username, password, and like principals, details, authorities, and it will also has a field called is authenticated. Yes, if I remember correctly, called is authentication or authenticated or authentication. I will show you later, which is this is a field, Boolean field, and this is authentication or is authenticated. That field will indicate is a true or false, which means is current user being authenticated or not. Okay, so here by default it's gonna be false. Okay, and later on if it's being authenticated, it's gonna be changed to be true. Okay. So next one. So this authentication object will contains our so far you can think as username and a password. Next one. This filter, it will delegate the authentication request to where? To Authentication Manager. This manager is an interface. Okay, so it itself doesn't do the authentication task, and in this authentication manager, it will only has one abstract method called authenticate. This authenticate method will actually do authentication. Okay, and since it's an interface, so it have the implementation class is called the Provider Manager. This is implementation class. Okay, and interestingly, first I want to, before we continue, I want to mention a little bit of thing. Okay, so this Authentication Manager, how can we get an Authentication Manager? Yes, based on you configured. Do you remember last video? We talked about it here. Authentication Manager, okay? So if we don't configure anything, then, if we don't configure anything, this Authentication Manager will be provided by us, provided by Spring Security. But if we configure that method, that Authentication Manager Builder will based on the configuration you provide, you are using in memory, or you are using JDBC, or you are using DLO to provide you correct Authentication Manager in order to do the authentication. You got it? Okay. That is that configuration. Okay. In the configuration file, you config. Then this Authentication Manager will based on your configuration to generate an Authentication Manager to you. Okay. And the implementation is a Provider Manager. Interestingly, this Provider Manager itself also don't do authentication itself. Instead, it will delegate the request to different authentication provider. And here we only give one example. This Authentication Provider Manager will manage a collection of authentication provider. Okay, and this authentication provider, it also has many implementations. And the one used inside, suppose we just query to our database, it's called a DLO Authentication Provider. Well, let me, I want to erase one step. How can I erase? Can I erase one step? Erase this one, okay. And it also have others. Later on, when I show you the flow, it will also has one called anonymous authentication provider. Okay, this one is also, and but the main task, which the main provider, which in our case to do the authentication, is this DLO Authentication Provider. And this DLO Authentication Provider, what is it gonna do? It's gonna have a method called retrieve user based on the username. So in Spring Security, it doesn't use the username password we input in the browser to query the database. Instead, he only use what? He only use the username to query the database to see if I can grab a user using the username. Then he will wrap everything in user details. User detail, it will contains everything everything we grabbed using username from no matter it's in memory or JDBC or database. Okay, so this user detail will also contains username and password. Suppose we saved into a database, okay? And that's this DLO Authentication Provider give us, okay? And after that, the Spring Security will do is compare this user detail, okay, with this authentication object, which is generated here. Because this authentication object will contains the username password the user inputs input from the browser, right? The log form. And this user detail, this object actually is interface, okay? It definitely gonna have a class implements user detail interface like a user. This user detail will contains username and the password, the information we saved in DB. And this authentication, which is the username and the password from UI, okay, which is from the browser. So later on, Spring Security will check, does the username match the UI's username? A definite match. Does the password match the password the user input? And if it's successful, which means they match each other, two passwords, then it will encapsulate all the information back to the authentication object. And meanwhile, it will set this is authentication that field to be true. And also it will do other things like put in the authentication object in thread local, and eventually it will put the authentication which is into the session, because later on when the user make the consecutive request, it won't need to log in again, right? And in our case so far, we were using session to manage, and that's other things we will introduce later. Okay, so now on, we just briefly introduce the flow. Now I will show you the flow actually happened in our Spring Security source code. Okay, so discard. I will go to Spring Security. This is our still the demo. Okay, this is our demo. I didn't do anything. I didn't change anything. So now let's find the sorry, not this one, called the username password authentication filter. We were using a Java since I downloaded the source code. So here I will add it definitely has a do filter method. This one, it's implemented in the superclass. This one, because this filter, it extends from here, which and this generic filter bin is implemented filter. Okay, so this is a Java web-based filter, and the do filter method is inside its abstract class. So username password authentication filter itself doesn't have the do filter method, but it's different. See, in the abstract class, which is superclass, you can see the do filter. This do filter will pass to this do filter, and you are trying to do attempt authentication, and this part is done by the subclass, which is username password authentication filter, and it has attempt authentication. You can see here, and we add a point here, authentication attempt authentication filter, and it will take a look at it. Will make sure it must be a post request. Okay, if it's not a post, it doesn't support. Okay, so if we create our own, customize our own login page, we have to make sure the method we must use a post, and after that it will trying to get a username from the request object and get the password from the request object, and then he will generate a username which is authentication object. This username password authentication token is actually a subclass of authentication object. Okay, let me show you. See here, this is authentication object, and this authentication object will contains authorities, credentials, details, which is user details, and the principal represent the logged in user, and it's called is authenticated. Okay, it will return true if it has been authenticated. Okay, so next one, set details is it will add extra information about like a remote login IP address and the session ID. And then it will delegate the request to Authentication Manager to authenticate. You can see here, this is Authentication Manager to do the authentication, which is from the filter. It will delegate to Authentication Manager. It will only has one authenticate method. Okay, and the authenticate method will have authentication. So now here you can see here it has many implementation, and the one we use here is called the Provider Manager. Okay, so it implements Authentication Manager. You can see here, and Provider Manager also has the authenticate method. Okay, this is authenticate method. We are trying to do the authentication, and how to do authentication itself doesn't do, but the authentication Provider Manager will manage a collection of authentication provider, and based on our configuration, it will choose the right authentication provider to do the authentication. Okay, so here you can see it will loop and trying to find, and if it find one, it will trying to do authenticate. Okay, and it will give you result. okay, to see if it's authenticated or not authenticated. This is this part do. But the one we will go is go to the Authentication Provider. See here, Authentication Provider, we are also have also the authenticated method, okay, and you will see many providers. See here, you have many providers, and later on when we do debug, you will see one of is called Anonymous Authentication Provider, and this one is trying to see, this anonymous is trying to see if we already have authentication object or not. If not, it will create one for us, okay. But this provider doesn't actually do the authentication, okay. So we don't need to actually go inside here. There's another one which will be used here. Sorry, not this one. Here is called the DL Authentication Provider. For all the demos we introduce in this playlist, it will always use this DL Authentication Provider, and it's gonna have a retrieve method, which is here. So like I mentioned before, Spring Security will load the user details only based on the username. He doesn't using username password. And when we actually provide a DL service letter, and you will see it, we will only implement load user by username this method. Okay, that's the reason. Okay, why only pass username? Because Spring Security will based on username to fetch the entire user information, then compare later. Okay, it doesn't using username and password. So here, load by user, it will return a user detail, and this user detail is actually an interface, and one implementation which is user. See here, this user is one implementation, and later on I will show you to create our own. Okay. So here, once you find the user, if it's cannot find, okay, if cannot find, it will throw exception, which means it doesn't have an user information, doesn't have a user which exists using this user, okay, and it will have three exceptions. It will catch like username not found and other things, okay, and if it find, it will return loaded user, and then we will do the other authentication like create a success authentication or others, and then eventually it will go back to our let me so many here. It will go to that filter. Yeah, not here. Okay, this abstract will return. It will go to our abstract. Then here we will have not this one. It should be go to this one. No, this one. Do filter this one. And attempt. And if it's a result, it will return. It will do the if it will. This one is once it authenticated, it will trying to put our authentication information in the session, and then it will call the success. Okay, and if it failed, it will call the unsuccess. Okay, now let me show you the entire flow. Okay, so let me make some point. Okay, did I make on that DAO authentication provider? Did I make a note? Okay, now we are done. So now I will using a debug mode. Okay, and so far our username and password is all generated by Spring Security debug mode. Let's start. Okay, I will quit and restart. So here is our password, and I will go to the page, which is localhost 8080, right? It will go to login page. I will type user and a password, and now sign in. Then it will go to our, see here, the username password authentication filter. Okay, so it's actually passed through here. Okay, do filter. Then it will go the subclass attempted authentication, and first we will check if the request method is a post or not. Okay, if it's a post, it will continue. See here, now we will continue. And it will get our username. See here, it will get the username. Okay, username is username. And now it will trying to get the password. Okay, after password, this is the password we put. And now it will trying to create authentication object. This username password authenticate token is a subclass of authentication object interface. Okay, so now after that, you will see this auth request. See here, this auth request will have the principal is an object, and have a credentials. Okay, and have authorities. We don't have authority. And see here, authenticated is a false. Okay, so now I will go inside set details. You will see have some remote API those things being done. So after we set up details, it will you see the changes on the auth request. Okay, see here, this still auth request. See, this is privacy, right? Set details will make this details is being added in the auth request or populated in auth request, and you will see the remote address and session ID is being generated for current user. This will be used later. Okay, that's a set details being done. And then it will go to authenticate method in Authentication Manager. So we step into. This is the authenticate object in Provider Manager. You can see, and we can step over. Okay, you will see the provider size. The first one is anonymous because this one is trying to see if you have the authentication object or not in security context. We can step over. We're going step over. Okay, continue, because anonymous authentication provider doesn't provide authentication for the two test. Two test represent that authentication object, which is auth request. Okay, which is doesn't support. So you will see it will, when we continue, it will go again. Okay, and now there's still this one. Okay, now let me step over. Okay, we goes back. So now because that anonymous authentication provider doesn't do authentication, okay, because it doesn't support for our authentication way. So the next one we are trying to loop find the correct one. Okay, so the one we're doing is here. See here, the provider now is the DLO authentication provider. Okay, is called DLO authentication provider, and we can go inside. And does it support for our authentication? Two tests is represent the authentication. So does this DLO authentication provider support these two tests? You will see it's gonna support it, so it's want to continue. See here, it's a log tracer. This is done. So now it's gonna do authenticate. Okay. So if you want, we can step into. So here is to do authenticate, and now step over username, determine the username. So username gonna be the user, right? And it's not a cached. Okay, step over user details. Okay, which is that do we have a cache one? And the user details, we don't have cache one, right? So now we will trying to do what? Retrieve. Okay, retrieve user. Okay, see here, when we're trying to retrieve user from here, from where, I forgot from where, this one. From retrieve user, it will go to DL authentication provider to trying to retrieve user. Okay, so now we will step over. Okay, it will trying to call the user detail service and load by username user to retrieve the user. So far, this user will be empty once I'm done. I step over. See, you can see loaded the user, which is the one stored in the database. This loop means no password encoder. Okay, user and this one. And this loaded user later on will be compared with this authentication. Okay, so we'll step over, loaded user, go back and step over, and step over. Then this check is to check what? this user is what? This user is a user actually query from database. Okay, eventually gonna be. This check, if we go inside, you will check something like yes, the expired, enable, those things. Okay, let me show you. Yes, account not locked, enabled, expired, those. Okay, over. And this additional check is we'll check the kind of like credentials, those things. Okay, if you go inside, it will say get a credentials not none, and it has credentials. This present password later on it will do a bicryption. Okay, so let me see. Authentication get a credentials. Authentication. See here, this is still plain text, right? And later on, it will trying to do a bicryptation. Okay, so this one, it will trying to do what? Encoding. This password encoder in our case actually is a no encoding, and you are trying to match the present password is equals to user details get a password. This present password is from where? From the authentication object, which is what? Which is user input in the browser, and this user details get a password. This password is where? This password is the password we fetched from the database using the username. Okay. So it will trying to see if they match or not using the password encoder, because we can provide different password encoder to encode our password, right? And if it works, then it will return. Otherwise, it will throw the exception, which is bad credential exception. Okay. So in our case, it is success. Okay. So now go. Then it will check other things like a step over. It will check the authentication. Like yes, not expired. Okay. Then step over. Not expired is a cached user. Other informations. Okay. Now principal to return. Okay, to return back and to continue, and other things. And create a success authentication. We can go inside what it's doing. It will trying to do the encoding. You can see here. So far our principal you can see is a plain text, and authentication everything is a plain text, and user everything is a plain text, right? And here we are trying to using the bicryption to do the cryption. You can see here. Okay. Oh my god. So now see here, the new password is bicrypt for us, because we cannot contain the necessary credential information, which is the password inside our like session or the cookie or those information in there, right? So see here, the new password after done, it's gonna be encrypted. Okay. So after this one done, we will result gonna be the authenticated the user. Okay, then not go. I want to show you later. This erase credentials after authentication, which means it's gonna erase all the credentials from authentication object and other objects, because we cannot carry the authentication which are credentials inside the authentication object. Later on. This one is a publish authentication success, and the other corresponding subscriber will know. Okay, our authentication is success. So okay, let's go. I want to show you other things. Yes, here I just continue. Okay. Yes. Okay. Now is so. After the authentication being done, we will take a look at this authentication object. Okay, let me show you. Next one. Authentication result. So here you will see these credentials, the authentication result is still called authentication. Okay, but now you see the credentials is none because of that erase. Okay, and the principals will contains our user. Okay, and the password is also set to be none. At the beginning, this authentication object will contain the username and the password, right? But after the erase, all the credentials are being removed. And again here, authenticated become true. Okay, and after that, if it's a success, it will go to set the session. Okay, and then it will go to the success authentication. And success authentication, this security context, yes, you to get the security context, you can think security context is a wrapper to local thread. Okay, we will mention it later. And which is put our authentication result along with the local thread. Eventually, we will put the information in the session. And the other thing done will be how to handle the remember me. Okay, if we have remember me, and later on we will show you. Okay, remember me, like when we log in success and click remember me, it will do either using the cookie to do or using the persistence. Okay, and then it will notify our this one a publish event, which is its success, and other success handler for handle the authentic success. But if where it is, do filter, if it failed, then it will have unsuccess authentication. Take a look at, and unsuccess authentication, it will say remember me failed, and the failure handle will handle like ours authentication failed. Okay, but in our case, it's a success, right? So I will step over. Okay, remember me, trying to handle for remember me and success and event publish and other things. Okay, so I will make it all success, and it will go to next filter. Okay, I will just make it resume the program, and now in our browser we logged in successfully and we are able to see the page, right? So this is the basic flow of authentication. Okay, let's review again. So it starts with username, password, authentication filter, and it will go to this attempt authentication, and this attempt of authentication is actually overrides from the abstract authentication processing filter, and it's gonna have a do filter method. Okay, and this do filter method will delegate the actual authentication to the username password authentication filter. Okay, eventually it will give an authentication result will contains the username, and the is authenticated will represent is authenticated or not. Okay, and if it have a result and a success, it will do something. Okay, and if it's failed, it will go to the unsuccess for authentication. And this username password authentication filter, it will based on the request to generate an authentication object. This authentication object will contain username and password, and the set details just to have extra information, and it will delegate request to Authentication Manager authenticate. And this Authentication Manager, it will delegate to Provider Manager. Provider Manager will have authenticate method, but it itself also doesn't do the authentication. Instead, it will delegate the request to the proper authentication provider. In our case, this authentic provider to do the authentication, this one is actually what? Is actually our DLO authentication provider. And DLO authentication provider, it will have a load user. Okay, and eventually this loaded user will be, I forgot which one. Okay, will be compared with the authentication object, which is this one. Sorry. This loaded user eventually will compare with this authentication, because this loaded user will have a username and a password, and this authentication object will also has a username password. Then it will compare if each other are match using the password encoder .match method. And if it match, it will go through other things like erase credentials from authentication objects and principal. So after everything is done, it will go back to our that filter, this abstract filter. Okay, which is do filter method, which is this part, and the authentication object will be already being authenticated, and the authenticated will equals to true. Okay, and then it will do other things like go to successful or go to unsuccessful. Okay, so that's the basic flow for our authentication. Okay, and the next demo, what I'm gonna do is so far our username and password for login. This one is running. Okay, console. So far our username password are hard coded, right? And in the following demos, I will show you different ways like query database and query database. We also have two ways. One is using query SQL, and the other one is to actually implement here the user detail service, implement provide our own, load the user by username. Okay, this method to query the database. Okay, so I'm not sure if you understand the basic flow. Probably we can do a review later. Okay, anyway, that's it for this authentication flow. And after this authentication object being authenticated, it also has other things to be done, and I will introduce in later videos. Okay, so thank you for watching my videos. See you next time. Bye bye.